Hey everyone, welcome back to Christ is the Cure. Today we are continuing our talk on Zoroastrianism. If you hear a lot of noise in the background, I'm sorry. I have a metal roof, and it rained last night, so things are dropping onto the roof, and then the wind's blowing around, and so it gets noisy. There's also a lot of planes flying today too, so there's that. Anyway, today we are going into the holy book of Zoroastrianism called the Avesta. Going to throw it out there for anyone who's listening, who's an adherent of Zoroastrianism or comes from the culture in general. I apologize in advance if I mispronounce anything. It's kind of a staple of my show that I can fumble words, and so it's not intended to be disrespect to you or your culture. Just wanted to throw that out there. That's just me. So let's get into the Avesta, which, like the Bible, it is a collection of sacred texts ranging in date of writing. Originally, the Avesta was made up of 21 books, but it's estimated that 3/4 of its contents have been lost. And so the current Avesta is a compilation of fragmentary texts gathered and codified by the Sasanian Empire. The most ancient manuscript of the Avesta that we have is from the 13th century, more specifically AD 1288. Now, the traditional or legendary history, however you want to frame that, of the book states that the text existed in early form, yet during Alexander the Great's conquest, it was destroyed. Eventually, fragments were collected along with orally transmitted tradition underneath the Sasanians beginning in the 3rd century AD. And then in the 4th century, the canon was revised and orthodoxy for Zoroastrianism was established. And the final revision into the language of New Persian was completed in the 6th century AD. But on the legend, the Encyclopedia Iranica on the Avesta, Survey of History and Content, says, quote, "The testimony of the Mazdean religious tradition is often incoherent and cannot be taken literally. It must necessarily be confronted with the results of modern scholarship, which leads to different stages in the formation and transmission of the Avestan texts," end quote. So Iranica points out that the legend mentioned is less than trustworthy, as there was never an Avesta set down underneath the Achaemenids. We talked about them last time. And since there was no text, there was no text to be destroyed, right? Further, quote, "The Avestan texts cannot be dated accurately, nor can their language be located geographically," end quote. Instead, and as Zoroastrian scholars have noted, the texts of the canon were written in different periods and require chronological distinctions. So here's the general textual timeline of the Avesta as put forward by Jenny Rose in her introduction on Zoroastrianism. It goes like this. First is the Old Avestan, and she dates this to the mid to 2nd millennium BC, being orally transmitted, consisting of the Gathas, which, if you remember, the Gathas are the texts thought to be penned by Zoroaster himself, the Yasna and prayers. Following this are the Young Avestan texts. I'm not going to try to name them. I may just put this timeline in the description. That way I don't butcher the name. I don't really want to do that. But I wanted to mention the Gathas because that was crucial as the text of Zoroaster, right? That's considered the Old Avestan. And then the Young Avestan dates from the early to mid 1st millennium BC, also orally transmitted, not put on paper, and this includes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 texts. And then in the 6th and 7th centuries AD, so you're talking the 500s and the 600s AD, the Avestan corpus was written down. So now we have the written text. And then you have the Middle Persian Zoroastrian texts written down in the 9th century AD, so the 800s. And this includes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 texts. And then you have the New Persian texts that were written in the 11th century, so AD 1000 to today, which I don't know that there's many modern texts, but she has to present. And in this collection, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 texts. So it is generally acknowledged that the precise date of the Old Avestian text is impossible to establish, but consensus places the oral Gathas in this collection at 1000 BC. Now, because Iranian people didn't use writing in earlier periods, oral transmission was the primary mode of text movement. Written documents by the Iranians were rare until the Sasanians emerged, though it is said that the oral transmission was precise and careful. And you'll find this claimed in all of the texts on Zoroastrianism, including Rose and Encyclopedia Iranica. So the earliest dating of the Old Avestan text comes from looking at the language put together by the Sasanians and comparing it with other languages, but it is a linguistic estimation that, as many have noted, cannot really be dated accurately, with certainty anyway. In addition to this, it has been noted by Zoroastrians and non-Zoroastrians alike that the translation and interpretation of the Avesta, even the Gathas, is particularly difficult. Coupled with the living nature of Zoroastrianism and its developments, the text and its doctrines are difficult to find uniformity on. Jenny Rose alludes to this, along with others that I've cited who come from that perspective. Now, that doesn't really concern us. Our concerns are those questions of influence. Did Zoroastrianism influence Judaism and Christianity? And it's been noted by Zoroastrians and non-Zoroastrians that the question becomes difficult because what we know of Zoroastrianism on pen and paper is from the 6th century AD, after the New Testament and long after the Old Testament. And this also occurs in a tradition that is evolving and is debated on significant points. But what happens is the Zoroastrianism of the Avesta is inserted into the BCs and presupposed as the influence on Judaism and Christianity when the Sasanians are writing in the post-Christ context. To illustrate the problem, consider what agnostic scholar Bart Ehrman on the question of Zoroastrian influence on Jewish understandings of the resurrection says. Quote, Brimmer points out that our oldest manuscript of the Zoroastrian text in question, the Avestas, dates from 1288 CE, or AD, and all the surviving manuscripts appear to go back to a copy that had been produced in the 9th or 10th century AD. Since the Zoroastrian tradition was living and constantly changing over time, there is no assurance that the teaching of the later Avestian manuscripts were ancient. After some detailed comments, Brimmer concludes, there is little reason to derive Jewish ideas about the resurrection from Persian sources. Their origins may well lie in their intra-Jewish developments. End quote. And that's from his article, Was Resurrection a Zoroastrian Idea? Now, with admitted developments within the Zoroastrian community and such a late textual footprint, we are left with little evidence of the claims of influence, not to mention the possibility of influence actually going the other way around. Instead, it appears to be begging the question because we know little about most of the early history of Zoroastrianism and its beliefs, which we discussed last time. So is it possible that influence actually went the other way around? Absolutely, because they are firstly writing in a post-Christ context. And when it comes to the person of Zoroaster, Zoroastrian scholar Jenny Rose in her work, The Image of Zoroaster, states, quote, the incorporation of certain motifs into the Zoroastrian tradition in the 9th century CE could indicate the conscious attempt of the priesthood to exalt their prophets in the eyes of the faithful who may have been tempted to turn to other religions, end quote. Not only this, but as we will see later, other doctrines of similar taste not only have biblical warrant before the Persian period, but some of the doctrines that allegedly came from Zoroastrianism come from the text in the Middle Persian Zoroastrian 9th century period, not in the period before Christ. In terms of written history, the facts remain that the Avesta was still written several centuries following the inception of Christianity, and assertions that the well-established Christian presence in Iran during the Sasanian period had no bearing on Zoroastrianism to some degree or another seems implausible to maintain. In fact, we have clear understanding of interactions between these two groups, pulling from rivalry and conflicts between Christians and Zoroastrians by Manfred Hutter. Quote, the encounter of Christianity with Zoroastrianism in the Sasanian Empire started already in the 3rd century, but it was only since the 5th century that a sizable number of Zoroastrianisms, mostly from the upper classes, converted to Christianity. This led to reactions by the Zoroastrian clergy against the adherents of the false or bad religion, as this religion was seen as unfitting to Iranian culture. Thus, Middle Persian texts discuss the necessity to avoid contacts with members of this religion. This term is not restricted to Christianity, that is a term meaning the bad or false religion, but can also be applied to other religions. It is only from the early Islamic period into Iran that two Middle Persian texts discuss Christian teachings more systematically. The reason for this theological discussion about Christianity can be seen in the minority situation which Zoroastrianism faced in the Islamic period, end quote. And so, if Zoroastrianism felt compelled to incorporate motifs regarding Zoroaster to avoid confusion about other religions, as Jenny Rose says, because of conversions to Christianity, it would not be far-fetched to say that this couldn't happen elsewhere with other doctrines. For example, Zoroastrianism allegedly influenced the concept of Messiah or Savior, but all explicit messianic descriptions of the Saoshyant, that is, this messianic figure, come from medieval texts, long after the New Testament, not to mention the Old Testament. And this can be said about other things as well. So this is not to say with certainty that Christianity influenced Zoroastrianism. I'm not saying that with certainty. But I am saying that it seems more likely and more verifiable given what we just heard from Rose, from Hutter, and what we know about the dating of the documents and known interactions. So what I really want to summarize here is that it is difficult to argue that Zoroastrianism influenced Judaism and Christianity based on what we concretely have about Zoroastrianism on paper. But now we can actually talk about some of the doctrines, which we'll start this episode because that went really quickly. So our first doctrine to talk about is monotheism. Zoroastrianism is credited as the oldest monotheistic religion, and it influenced Judaism, right? We talked about all that. So let's talk about it in a little bit more depth now. Now, the topic of monotheism as it pertains to ancient Israel is actually a bit more complicated than some may think. And really, it's a matter of fine details. Some claim that the ancient Israelites were polytheists who worshipped many gods, but eventually developed into monotheists. But then even how monotheism is defined can also be debated. And usually it is critiqued because, as a term itself, monotheism was coined in the 17th century to counter atheism. Specifically, it was created to say that instead of the notion that there was no God, it said, yes, there is a God. And then as time went on, it came to mean that there is only one God in existence to the exclusion of others. At any rate, most deny the idea that polytheism was the observance of ancient Israel, and instead they'll propose that ancient Israel held to monolatry. This term means that they believed many deities and gods existed, but Yahweh was supreme and the unique God. In other words, he was the only one who deserved worship. This is contrary to henotheism, which says that there is devotion to a primary god, but there are other gods and you are allowed to worship them too. There's just a supreme god also. And then, of course, polytheism is the belief in many gods that can be worshipped as one desires. Back to monolatry, it basically posited exclusive devotion to one god despite recognizing the existence of others. And this needs to be contrasted with henotheism because it implies a focus on one primary god with openness to others being worshipped. Now, given recent controversies, it's worth stating in passing that Michael Heiser, on the subject of the Divine Council, rejects polytheism and the notion that Israel evolved into monotheism from polytheism. He doesn't hold to that. You can see that in The Unseen Realm, page 29, for example. And he also doesn't find monolatry to be a sufficient term in his work on the topic either, and he also rejects henotheism. He actually has a journal on that if you care. I know that there was a big to-do about all that, I don't know, not too long ago. But the journal is called Monotheism, Polytheism, Monolatry, and Henotheism Towards an Assessment of Divine Plurality in the Hebrew Bible. If you just Google that, you'll be able to find it, I'm sure. Now, Michael Patton essentially argues that in progressive revelation, namely in the New Testament, there's a shift from monolatry to what we understand as monotheism. This, he says, is seen in 1 Corinthians 8, 4 through 8. He argues that God permitted the belief in other gods to remain and progressively corrected this belief, moving from "you shall have no other gods before me" to "you shall have no other gods." And that is from the Credo House article, "Is Christian Polytheism Possible?" Others will use monotheism with qualification, such as, quote, "Monotheism is a useful term insofar as it captures Israel's insistence that its deity, Yahweh, is categorically supreme," end quote. And that is from Behind the Scenes of the Old Testament on monotheism. I can't remember whose article that is, but it's edited by Jonathan Greer, John Hilber, and John Walton. It's a great book. Anyway, the topic is interesting and complex, and one that we're not moving into now. So you're like, why'd you say all this? And it was necessary. These pieces were necessary to lay out when we are asking ourselves, well, did Zoroastrianism influence Judaism regarding monotheism? Now, it should be noted that monolatry or monotheism, whichever one you want to take, before the Persian period, remember that's our key period, in the Hebrew Bible is evident. Deuteronomy 4:35-39 and 32-39. We don't really need to say more there because we've already discussed the idea that the Hebrew Bible was revised to reflect Zoroastrian influence in episode 2. And so we're not going to say much more than, well, we already kind of concluded that that's something that doesn't really have evidence and can't be proven. Now, from here, I'm just going to use monolatry and monotheism interchangeably for my own sanity, so I don't have to keep saying both of them. Lynch's understanding of monotheism that I quoted earlier from Behind the Scenes of the Old Testament is really what we're operating with here. Just, quote, monotheism is a useful term insofar as it captures Israel's insistence that its deity Yahweh is categorically supreme, which means, of course, in other cultures with other deities, those deities would be viewed as supreme. And so it's dedication to a single God as the supreme God that deserves worship. Again, not to be confused with henotheism, which is important. So let's talk about Zoroastrian influence. Now, beyond arguments of Israel's own conceptions of monotheism and the Hebrew Bible itself, we can say this: even if a monotheistic source outside of Israel influenced Israelites to become monotheist, they actually encountered it years before encountering the Persians, before the Persian period. And this really makes me wonder why Zoroastrianism is called the first ancient monotheistic religion, especially whenever it's debated regarding its own monotheistic status among its own community, both concerning its past doctrine and present, usually lending itself more to henotheism. And we're going to get to that later. But the majority, if not all, recognizes that it's difficult to determine Zoroastrianism's exact place on the spectrum regarding monotheism. And so it's difficult to understand how Zoroastrianism could influence Judaism on monotheism, especially with what we know about how Judaism ended up, if you're taking a developmental idea, especially when there isn't certainty on Zoroastrianism's actual position on monotheism to begin with. So we're going to discuss both those points here. First, monotheism pre-Persia, and then Zoroastrianism's monotheism. To the first point about Israel encountering monotheists before the Persians, we have in the 14th century BC, that is 1400 to 1301, roughly around 1370, in Egypt, we have the establishment of Atonism. And this was about 830 years before Cyrus the Great captured Babylon. Akhenaten of Egypt prohibited the worship of any deity except Aten, the sun deity. And this is well known enough that some debate that this monotheism influenced Israel, as Israel could have been directly impacted by it in a scheme that places the Exodus in the 13th century or indirectly in the 15th century date for the Exodus. And for more on that, you can actually see, again, the relevant article in Behind the Scenes of the Old Testament. They talk about this as well. But even beyond this, still before the Persians, Babylon was also monotheistic, though with more political emphasis. For Babylon, Marduk was supreme and universally so. Now, there were multiple deities in Babylon, but they were all manifestations of the single god Marduk. This notion of summon deism, summo-deism, I don't know how you say that one, is the, quote, belief that many deities who formerly made up a pantheon are aspects or functions of a chief god, end quote. And that's also from that article in Behind the Scenes of the Old Testament. So in other words, there is one God. He just manifests himself in other deities. The proximity of Israel being in Babylonian exile is evident. And so for some who hold that Israel developed monotheism from other cultures, this is where they picked it up. And so you can kind of see where I'm getting at here. And then at the same time, some scholars believe that the more strong monotheistic texts in the Hebrew Bible emerged in reaction to Babylon's claim to Marduk supremacy. This view of Marduk and Cyrus's claim to be a devotee to Marduk, if you remember in episode 2, also further flies in the face of Zoroastrian's claims of Cyrus being this devout Zoroastrian. What's interesting is that Lynch, in his discussion on monotheism in Israel and Behind the Scenes of the Old Testament, doesn't even bring up Zoroastrianism. Instead, he ties more explicit monotheistic expressions of Israel's writers to their interactions with Babylon. He argues that the rhetorical expressions against other deities were elevated further, refining or pushing Israel into more explicit monotheism. In summary, there are encounters that predate Persian encounters that undermine the Zoroastrian claim at the outset. Further, while it is held even among conservative evangelicals that the Israelites held to monolatry and became more and more aligned with God's monotheistic expressions, the encounter with the other monotheistic expressions didn't influence them in giving to them anything new concerning Yahweh's supremacy. Instead, there is a digging in of heels when faced with other deities who were claiming supremacy, right? There's rhetorical pushback against those claims by saying, no, our God is the supreme. Now, with progressive revelation and the purging of idolatry, and then rhetoric framed specifically against another deity, do not really pose a problem for Christians regarding their theology. But the whole point here really is that why Zoroastrianism when there were other monotheists that Israel encountered before Zoroastrianism underneath the Persian rule? So let's talk about monotheism and Zoroastrianism, and then we'll stop this episode and continue doctrines in the next episode. So when it comes to Zoroastrian's own position, aside from the difficulties we've already expressed regarding how, Zoroastrian were the Persians to begin with, where was the overlap with Israel, the nature of the Avesta and its dating, the current status of Zoroastrianism on this question is debated. And of course, for those who do hold that Zoroastrianism is monotheistic, there's debates about when this monotheism actually came about. So some Zoroastrians have argued that Zoroastrianism is best understood as dualistic polytheism. They argue that the many temples of worship persisted until Zoroastrianism was pressed by two monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam, especially in the 1800s. One article I found by a Zoroastrian, Pablo Vasquez, points out that historically Zoroastrians were openly polytheistic, with surrounding cultures like the Greeks recognizing this. And you can find that article, O Wise One and You Other Ahuras, The Flawed Application of Monotheism Towards Zoroastrianism. And he notes that Zoroastrians in the mid-1800s were reformed due to the missionary John Wilson and the Zoroaster apologist Martin Hug, or Haug, I'm not sure. So the missionary John Wilson addressed the Zoroastrians as polytheistic nature worshippers, which, quote, caused the uneducated Parsi population to support an understanding of Zoroastrian theology that aligned itself closer to the religion in that area at the time, Christianity. Martin Hug's conception then of Ahura Mazda being the sole deity of the religion, with the Amisha, Spinta, and the Yatsta merely being angels, became readily accepted by the reformers seeking to banish the predations of the missionaries, who then spread it to Iran. And so this shift included Haug likening Mazda to Yahweh as the only one God and insisting on the monotheism of the Gathas. Haug agreed that monotheism was the pure teaching of the Gathas and that Zoroaster's teachings were corrupted by later generations. And Vasquez will state on this that this monotheistic mode of thinking has continued to even the internet age, with popular and often quoted by adherents, news sources, and academics, and Zoroastrian websites and videos pushing the constant narrative of Zoroastrianism being the world's first and oldest monotheistic faith with no assisting gods or goddesses. In other words, it appears that Zoroastrian monotheism, or the emphasis on a monotheistic conception of Zoroastrianism, emerged in the 1800s as a response to Christian missionaries. Other Zoroastrians retain polytheistic theologies and practices, yet designate the religion as monotheistic. It is admitted that Zoroastrianism has monotheistic/polytheistic/dualistic features, but retains the monotheistic label. The question is, how can that be? Both labels of monotheism and polytheism are argued from the same information regarding the Yazatas. The distinction is how the Yazatas are labeled, which is actually where the differences arise in Zoroastrianism doctrine and practice. Now, first, there is agreement that within the Zoroastrian framework there is one supreme god, Ahura Mazda, with devotion and ritual primarily focused upon him. And you can read Almut Hint's article, Monotheism and the Zoroastrian Way, from the Journal of the Royal Ascetic Society on this. And then secondly, in Zoroastrianism, there are Yazatas, sometimes called gods, divinities, or deities. Their name, the Yazatas, which hopefully I'm pronouncing correctly, literally means worthy of worship. And sometimes these are called angels, but this can lead to misconceptions, and so many don't accept that, except for Westerners on the pop culture level. Relying on Zoroastrian scholarship, these Yazatas were created from Ahura Mazda, created from his very substance, and, quote, everything that belongs to Ahura Mazda's spiritual and material world is potentially capable of being worshipped and is therefore a Yazata, that is, worthy of worship. And that's from Hence's article. Quote, the view that anything that comes from Ahura Mazda is worthy of worship enables the Mazdaean tradition to absorb other deities, old, such as Mithra, and new, and incorporate them into its own world and pantheon, provided that they are subordinate to Ahura Mazda. In this, there are legitimate cults of gods and goddesses, quote, alongside himself, without threatening his own primacy. Rather than being cultic competitors, the Yazatas thus strengthen and support Ahura Mazda. Alma notes that Christians, when interacting with Zoroastrianism, viewed their worship as Yazatas as pure idolatry, and, quote, ranging from disputations of apostates during the Sacian period to John Wilson in the 19th century, the worship of the Yazatas, especially of the material ones, was one area in which Mazda worshippers were particularly targeted by polemical attacks, end quote. The attacks, of course, being charges of idolatry. In Zoroastrianism, it is claimed that because the Yazatas are created from the substance of Mazda himself, they are worthy of worship. Thus, quote, one worships Ahura Mazda by worshipping his creations. And so, in other words, in their theology, Zoroastrians only worship one god Mazda, even when worshipping other deities, as they are the same substance as Mazda. They are considered the pantheon of Yazatas, and their cultic worship is not only tolerated and legitimized, but even requested by Ahura Mazda, end quote. And so if this is indeed the correct understanding of the Zoroastrian position, to which it seems to be the traditional view, regardless of labels, there is more of a sense of polytheism in the same vein as Hinduism, with deities being types of emanations of the Supreme Being. However, classifications of Hinduism are tricky as well. Some may even say that it's polytheistic, henotheistic, monotheism, whatever it may be. But even here, if we don't apply polytheism to Zoroastrianism, then henotheism can be applied here, which would be rejected by Christians. So if we grant this articulation as being monotheism, it still differs significantly from the exclusivist Jewish and Christian positions. This is not the position of the Israelites in a post-Persian monotheism. Again, raising the question of how is this an influence? Now, despite their failures and rebukes of the prophets, the Israelites' sacred texts called them to worship only one deity, Yahweh, and any worshiping of any other god was idolatry. And this is even reflected when we consider what the Zoroastrians have just said, that Christians were critiquing them for idolatry because of their view of the Yazatas. So moving on just a little bit, at this point we should note that within Zoroastrianism there are different classifications of the Yazatas, or angels. Some distinguishing the Yazatas from higher beings, the Amish Spintas. In contrast, others will classify the Amish Spintas as Yazatas. But to simplify, Yazata can be a broader category for some Zoroastrianism, where there are beings within that category, underneath Mazda, or it could be a specific class of beings. Most seem to use the former categorization, that is, this broader category of beings underneath Mazda. When classified, there are the Amisha Spintas, and these are the highest of beings, but then there's also Yazatas such as Mithra, who are kind of like a guardian angel. The Amisha Spintas help Mazda govern the world. There are 6 of them, each with their own task in creation and ministering. For example, one presides over lawful order of the cosmos and fire, and another over divine wisdom and love and good mind and purpose, and so forth. We're not really going into that. The Frav Ashish, I think that's how you say it, each accompany an individual person. They're kind of like guardian angels throughout their life until they die. Quote, if not for their guardianship, animals and people could not have continued to exist because of the wicked Druge, who would have destroyed them all, end quote. These also help preserve order in creation and fly like winged birds. The Yazatas, when treated as a single class, are the created spiritual beings that personify ideas, virtues, or concrete objects of nature. They help and protect people from evil, each with their own focus. For example, Mithra presides over contracts and is the personification of light. With all of this said, and as we conclude here, this particular episode, it is difficult to say that A, Zoroastrianism is monotheistic to begin with, and B, that it is monotheistic in the same way as Judaism and Christianity, and C, that it is monotheistic in a way close enough that it can be said to have influence on Jews and Christians. And none of this really accounts for the significance of the debates of the 1800s and their impact on Zoroastrianism. Again, years and years after the Sasanian period and everything else. And so the closest one can get to comparing the two is veneration of the saints seen in Eastern and Catholic traditions. Yet, even in those traditions, they will formally say that those saints are not worshipped, but just honored. And those traditions have a direct line of connection with an earlier cult of the martyrs. So it can't be tied to Zoroastrianism even there. Additionally, these discussions on the Yazatas show that there is really little meaningful parallel between angels and Christianity and Zoroastrianism, which we're going to get into that next time. But just think about what we know about angels from the Christian perspective and how these were described in terms of helping governing and protecting the world from evil and having domain over certain things in creation. That is not comparable, but people will say that Zoroastrianism influenced Christian view of angels. So we'll talk about that next time. So hopefully this was all sensible and laid out well enough. But the bottom line is the claim of monotheistic influence on Judaism and Christianity is pretty dubious. Of course, based off of what we know about the Persian period, or what we don't know rather, based off of when the texts were written down, and then now based off of the dubiousness of monotheism as the official doctrine of Zoroastrianism to begin with, which it appears to be more henotheistic, which was not the position of Jews and Christians, at least whenever they first encountered on paper the Zoroastrians during the Sasanian period. It's a lot of interesting stuff. There's a lot of different threads being pulled. And so if nothing else, hopefully this gives you something to think about. We'll talk about a couple more doctrines that Zoroastrianism allegedly may have influenced Christianity on, and then we'll conclude. And so I guess this will be a 4 to 5 part episode, including that combined episode at the end, which I hope that you guys have been enjoying the combined editions of these episodes. It may seem kind of weird, but I know some people really appreciate having everything in one episode like that. And so I wanted to kind of have both of those options for people. And so if you do the parts, then you get kind of an early chunk of the episode. But if you just want to wait and get the full episode, then there you go. Also, patrons, I'm working on proofreading all the notes for these episodes so that you have a nice, pretty written up edition. Hopefully I get that to you before they all air. So until next time, God bless you all and have a wonderful, wonderful day.